Abraham Lincoln was buried with items from a far-off land, and he even popularized a new process upon his death. But he's not the only president with a story to tell from the grave. In the later years of his life, George H.W. Bush earned a bit of notoriety for his unique footwear. Once he was confined to a wheelchair for most of his public appearances, his pants often rode up high enough to reveal his fun and colorful socks. And he certainly embraced this sartorial reputation. Bush's socks became so well known that the Republican Party even launched a line of striped ones as a fundraising operation. As a former president noted in an email from the Republican National Committee, "I'm a self-proclaimed sock man. The louder, the brighter, the crazier the pattern, the better." Bush even wore eye-catching socks to his wife Barbara's funeral in 2018, which was less than a year before his own passing. They were book-themed, as Barbara's signature initiative was tackling illiteracy. Even in death, Bush Sr. clearly wasn't going to stop indulging in his favorite fashion trend. As his spokesman Jim McGrath tweeted before his funeral, the 41st president will be carried to his final rest wearing socks that pay tribute to his lifetime of service, starting as an 18-year-old naval aviator in war. That description made them sound a bit more serious than the actual art of fighter planes flying in formation. They would have been outlandish for any other president to be buried in, but for George H.W. Bush, they were almost a bit boring.
His legacy is going to live on for a long time to come.
If a president wants to go into the ground in style and money is no object, then there's one place to turn to, the Marcellus Casket Company of Syracuse, New York. Or at least that was the case until 2003, when the company closed down. During their 131 years of operation, Marcellus even had a coffin model known as the President Mahogany. It's no surprise then that presidents like John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, as well as their first ladies, were buried in this model. Other politicians, including 2 senators and a vice president, chose it as well, along with a who's who of other rich and famous folks. Harry S. Truman was buried in a slight variation of the mahogany, while Ronald Reagan selected the masterpiece Mahogany Edition. Their wives, Bess and Nancy, were buried in the same caskets as their husbands. These are no plain boxes, but rather pieces of art, and very expensive pieces of art at that, as even before any modifications are made, they retail in the $20,000 to $40,000 range. Among all American presidents, the items that John F. Kennedy took to the grave seem to be the most well documented. This might simply be because his death was so tragic and unexpected, thus making every part of his funeral newsworthy. That would remain true long after he was laid to rest. In a 1996 interview, Joe Hagan, the mortician who was in charge of Kennedy's body after its journey from Dallas, revealed that he was asked about funeral details all the time, often by conspiracy theorists. But while he couldn't help them out by offering up any weird details, he did know exactly what the president was buried with. Kennedy was Catholic, so the burial items included a rosary as well as 3 letters from family members. He was also wearing gold cufflinks, as well as a PT-109 tie clip. The PT-109 was the small boat that he was on that sank during an encounter with the Japanese in 1943.
He was on the margins of the war, but he saw how a military operated not from the top down, but from the bottom up.
But the most notable item in Kennedy's mahogany casket was a piece of scrimshaw slipped in by his widow, Jackie. Scrimshaw was originally art created by men on whaling ships made to pass the time, and Kennedy had his own collection of the intricately carved bones. His favorite was the one that he took to his grave, which bore an etching of the presidential seal. It was a Christmas gift from his wife the year before. Before he became president, Dwight D. Eisenhower had already achieved a fair amount of fame as the Allied commander in Europe during World War II. For many, he would always be a military man first and a politician second. The choices he made surrounding aspects of his funeral and burial reflect that he felt the same way. Despite rising to the very top of the ranks as a 5-star general, he didn't want to be buried as a military leader, but rather as a common soldier. While he did get a large funeral service at Washington National Cathedral, almost everything else about the service was modestly themed.
I hope it doesn't prove to be a disturbing influence.
Rather than being buried in a general's uniform, Eisenhower requested the outfit that was so recognizable from his time in the war, including the famous Ike jacket. Nor did he go to his grave with all of his many medals, as he instead picked just 3: the Army Distinguished Service Medal, the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, and the Legion of Merit. And when it came to his coffin, he eschewed the fancy mahogany of other presidents, instead asking specifically for the $80 casket that was standard issue to regular soldiers. He was laid to rest in his hometown in Kansas. Calling what Rutherford B. Hayes chose to be buried alongside a thing is a little misleading, considering it was actually a once-living creature, or 2 of them actually. You can even make the case that Hayes and his wife Lucy are buried in a pet cemetery at their estate in Ohio, since they're outnumbered by the animals that surround them. One of those pets was a horse named Old Ned. He lived to be 36 before dying in 1871. He was owned by Hayes, but was also used as a buggy horse by his uncle, before eventually retiring for the last decade or so of his life. His grave is just behind the president's, and Old Ned's headstone is a small boulder with his name and dates etched in it. The Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum's website also mentions a horse named Old Whitey. He was part of Hayes' Civil War campaigns, where his bright coloring made him a target for Confederate bullets. But he survived the war and became a favorite pet of the president. Hayes loved the horse so much that he actually received a telegram at the White House in 1879 informing him that Old Whitey was about to pass away. Old Whitey is also buried next to Hayes, along with the president's greyhound, Grim, who was a bit of a celebrity during his time in the White House.
Even though President Hayes is not very well known, just an amazing story of the things that he and First Lady Lucy Hayes dealt with.
Thing is also a bit of a misnomer in the case of Ulysses S. Grant, but this is still a story worth telling. As it turns out, President Grant's insistence on being buried with his wife Julia completely changed his gravesite plans and even resulted in construction of an iconic New York landmark. Being buried with one's spouse is hardly a strange request. Indeed, plenty of presidents have been laid to rest with or next to their wives. But Julia Grant wasn't welcome at West Point, which was where her husband wanted to be buried. The problem was that the former First Lady didn't fit the criteria for burial at the military academy, and they weren't willing to bend the rules. But Ulysses wanted to spend eternity next to his beloved wife more than he wanted to be buried at a place that meant so much to him. So West Point was out. In the end, a plot of land in New York City was selected and a massive mausoleum was eventually built there, which is to this day the largest one in North America. The former president had to wait a while for his wife to join him though, as she outlived him by 17 years. So many aspects of Abraham Lincoln's funeral were abnormal. He technically had about a dozen funerals. As his body traveled by train from Washington, D.C. to Illinois, it was unloaded at various stops to allow hundreds of thousands of people to pay their respects. He was also embalmed, something that had become more common only a few years earlier. And in fact, it was all those people seeing his embalmed corpse that reportedly led to the procedure skyrocketing in popularity. Lincoln was buried in a suit with some significance, as he'd also worn it when he was sworn in as president for the second time just weeks before he was assassinated. Considering the monumental era during which he led the country, there were plenty of items that could have reasonably joined him in his grave. But even if you had an infinite number of guesses, you would probably never guess what he was actually buried with. At the time, the New York Herald reported about the involvement of Captain Parker Snow, who had gone searching for the lost Franklin expedition in the Arctic. Captain Snow offered to those in charge of Lincoln's funeral certain items that he believed were from the doomed men, including a page from a prayer book and bits of uniform. According to Russell Potter, an expert on the Franklin expedition and editor of a book of the expedition's letters, it's not clear why anyone would have agreed to bury them with Lincoln. Nevertheless, the people in charge reportedly did so.
Be excellent to each other.
Andrew Johnson became president in 1865 after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and his time in office was pretty much a disaster. He was the first president ever to face an impeachment trial, and he also came very close to becoming the first president removed from office, though he was ultimately saved by just one vote in the Senate. And that was actually the second time that Congress had attempted to remove him from office, though the first attempt at impeachment didn't pass the House of Representatives. Despite his disastrous tenure, Johnson loved his country in his own way. He didn't even let losing the Republican nomination for president in 1868 stop him from continuing his political career. He ran for United States Senate, won, and took office in 1875. His triumphant return to Washington, D.C. was rather short-lived, though, as he died that same year. Johnson's death served as another opportunity for him to demonstrate just how much his country meant to him, or maybe he just wanted to stick it to all those political rivals who had tried to throw him out of office. Accordingly, the former president chose to be buried literally wrapped in the American flag inside his coffin, along with a copy of the U.S. Constitution as his pillow. John Tyler is one of those presidents from shortly before the Civil War whose name kinda gets lost in the shuffle of American history. He was a one-term chief executive who served from 1841 to 1845. In a 2019 book in which historians ranked the first 43 presidents, he was chosen as the 5th worst. But Tyler does deserve to be remembered as the only American president to die and be buried in the Confederacy. Once the Virginian wasn't in charge of the country anymore, he openly supported splitting it up. When the South seceded, he served in the Confederate House of Representatives, or rather he was elected to serve but died before he could take his seat. Having a former president who not only sided with their cause but chose to live and die in the South was a coup within a rebellion that the Confederate government was quick to take advantage of. Tyler's funeral was thus a major event there, while at the same time it was virtually ignored by the North, who now considered Tyler a traitor. At the time, the richest and most important people in the country often covered their coffins in cloth. Abraham Lincoln's, for example, was completely covered in black broadcloth before his burial only a few years later. Tyler's final resting vessel was also covered in cloth. That was a choice that tied him to the traitorous rebellion forever, as he was buried with his coffin wrapped in a Confederate flag.